Today marking day 2 of the Civil Rights Summit out of Austin, Texas, and civil rights legends joining politicians, celebrities, and others who have successfully championed equality here. And it's been 50 years since that seminal document was signed, believe it or not. And our senior political reporter, Andrew Whitman, he is live in the Texas Capitol tonight, where he's had one-on-one interviews today with some of those giants, including Andrew, civil rights leader Andrew Young.
Yeah, Rich, much of the focus here at the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin was on the events of 50 years ago that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and how in many cases President Johnson, even Congress's hands were forced by the effectiveness of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, the March on Washington, and so on. Now, one of the key members of that team was Andrew Young. He was an aide, a friend, a confidant to Martin Luther King, who later was elected to Congress, became the mayor of Atlanta, and was also the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And I spoke with Ambassador Young about the impact of the Civil Rights Act being passed 50 years ago, and also some of the challenges it faces today, 50 years later. Mr. Ambassador, I'm curious, the Civil Rights Act, was there any indication, any thought in 1964 that the impact would go far beyond race, that it would go to gender or sexual orientation or any of the other applications we've seen in recent years?
I think we first of all knew that it would apply to women. In fact, the Women's Amendment was attached to the Civil Rights Act, thinking it was going to help kill it, and it only added on to it. I think that all of these issues were. I got picketed by a group of disabled people, and I immediately agreed with them that the Disabilities Act would not have happened if it had not been for the Civil Rights Act. And we had 10% of the population that's black, but at least 15% of the population is disabled in some way or other. So that every minority and every person with a grievance felt like they had access to a system that would listen to them.
How effective has the act been in the last 50 years in abridging some of those?
Oh, I think it's been extremely effective. I think if you look at Atlanta, where we made most of these things work. We were 1 million people we were less than 1 million in 1965. We're 6.5 million now. And that's growth of black and white alike, because we have made, we built the airport, but we wouldn't build it unless 35% of every contract was done by a minority, a female-owned company. We had the Olympics, and we did the same thing. And so we have integrated the wealth as we have expanded and grown the city.
Between recent rulings on voting rights acts and new voting rights laws, abridging some voting rights, affirmative action rulings, do you feel like the momentum from the '64 Civil Rights Act is beginning to erode?
Well, it should. You know, it's time for I mean, the issue is not simply political. Dr. King said that he wanted to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. Civil Rights Act of '64 was about racism, essentially, but it didn't do a lot for poverty until Lyndon Johnson, after Dr. King's death, expanded it to include aid to the disadvantaged, the whole Great Society legislation. But we just started on dealing with poverty, and it's a global. You can't deal with it locally anymore. There's global impact to almost everything we do economically.
And finally, where are we today compared to where you thought we'd be 5 decades ago?
Oh, well, gosh, I never thought any of the things that happened in my life would have happened. I figured I'd still be marching by now. And, I was really shocked. And I said if I had said to Dr. King on the road from Selma to Montgomery, you know, I want to be the mayor of Atlanta one day and a congressman, and maybe even ambassador to the United Nations, he'd have said, boy, you've been in the sun too long. It ain't going to be that easy.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you.
Thanks.
I was also able to catch up today with Julian Bond, best known as a former head of the NAACP, but he's also a beneficiary directly himself of the Civil Rights Act. He was elected to the Georgia State House of Representatives in 1965, something that was made possible solely because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Now, Mr. Bond has a reputation for being outspoken, something he demonstrated when we caught up earlier today. Where are we today on civil rights compared to where you thought we'd be in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was signed?
Well, it's not a sort of thing that you can say, well, we've come forward 10 times or 50 times or 40 times. We've made progress. This is a different country than it was 50 years ago. And in many ways, it's a better country, and it's a country that's going to get better. But we still have things we've not done, haven't paid enough attention to, haven't been successful at it, and we need to focus on those things.
Are you afraid of some of the trends that we've seen recently, Supreme Court rulings on Voting Rights Act, on voting restrictions around the country, affirmative action, that sort of thing, and the direction that there may be some blowback against civil rights progress?
I'm terribly afraid that we're taking steps backward on voting rights, on affirmative action, on a number of things that we're not doing what we should do. But I've always been an optimist. I've always believed the best things can happen. And so we'll just have to wait and see and work harder, work much harder than we're working now.
What do you make of when you hear people, especially white conservative Americans, cry out reverse racism or somehow white Americans are being disadvantaged as a result of things like affirmative action or rulings under the Civil Rights Act?
I say to myself, what have you been drinking? What have you been smoking? There's something wrong with your thought processes. These things you're fearful about are not happening. Think about it a little while, and I think you'll feel better.
But is there a way to change their minds short of something like that?
I don't know. I hope so, because I think they're wrong and wrong-headed. They're not wrong people, but they're wrong-thinking people. And if they think carefully about it, they'll feel better.
Finally, in 1964, most of the movement on civil rights was on racial equality, but the Civil Rights Act has been applied in so many different areas, gender equality, sexual preference, and so many other areas. Was that part of the thinking in 1964 when it passed? Did you expect that there would be progress in so many different venues?
I certainly didn't, and I don't think most people did. It's amazing, and I'm happy to see that others have profited from work I did and work I thought was aimed at people exactly like me. I'm happy to be able to have helped other people, and hope I can find other ways to help other people in the future.
I'll sneak one last question in if I can. Folks at home who are watching and thinking, what can I do to get involved and to help in progress for civil rights? What would you suggest to somebody?
I'd say you can join an organization. There are many organizations around the country that do this kind of work. All you have to do is look in the telephone book and find one, look on the internet and find one or two, look at all of them, find which one's best suited to you and join it. Say, here I am, I'd like to help. That's one thing you could do. You give money to an organization that's doing this kind of work. They all need money, no matter who they are, where they are. And you can engage your neighbors and make sure they join with you. If you do those three things, we'll be a better country tomorrow morning.
And we still have much more to get to here at the Civil Rights Summit in Austin, Texas tonight, Rich, including another appearance by a former president. Let's see here. I know it's a Southern Democrat. We had Jimmy Carter last night. Can't quite put my finger on who it is we're going to hear tonight. Maybe you can help me out with that, as I'll see you in the next segment, Rich.
Well, some people joking, thank you, Andrew. Some people, Dominic, joked around that he was the first black president. I'm talking about Bill Clinton of Arkansas. But, a couple things jumped out at me from what we heard from Andrew Young. And poverty was one of the three things that they went after. And they, everybody, let's be fair. If somebody said in 1964, we'd be doing this with a black president, right? And the different things that have happened. Do you ever imagine if Dr. King lived and if he was around today, what he'd say both good and bad about the progress and about black America today?
I can't begin to imagine what he would say about the first black president. I mean, I'm sure he would be extremely happy, but on the flip side of that, he would not have been happy at things like Trayvon Martin in Florida. He'd have been the first one down in Florida protesting. Even as an old man, if he was still alive, he'd be protesting poverty impacting all Americans, or a majority of Americans around the country. So I don't know exactly what he would say today, but that will always be the fascinating question. But what I can tell you is that for Andrew to talk to those two individuals, those are living legends of the civil rights movement. They walk the walk and talk the talk. Arrested, heads beat in, all for us to have a better America
They're talking
today.
about places like Selma, et cetera, and then they became senators. I mean, they became
Mayor of
lawmakers.
Atlanta.
They became mayors. They became, ambassadors to the UN and members of Congress. So, okay, when we come back, we will go back to Texas, and we're also going to learn about the role that sports legends, I'm talking about the Bill Russells, the Muhammad Alis here, the Jim Browns had on the movement as it relates here for equality in America on the 50th anniversary of the civil rights legislation being passed. Stay with Civil, and we'll be right back.